Good evening, everybody. I am Srishti from Rethinking Economics India Network, and it is my pleasure and privilege to welcome you all to the second session of our long series of events where we discuss issues around capitalism in March and patriarchy in April and try to make connections around the two systems. The Rethinking Economics India movement is the national network of the global Rethinking Economics movement. We operate as a nationwide ecosystem of stakeholders in the space of pluralist and heterodox economics, and we are looking to interface with individuals, academia, civil society, and other organizations in order to encourage teaching, learning, and discussion for scaling collaborative efforts towards a better, more inclusive economics for India and contribute towards the global movement at large. If you wish to learn more about our movement, please check out the links in the chat box below. For the second session in the series today, we have amongst us Sarah Jaffe. Sarah is a Type Media Center reporting journalist covering the politics of power from workplace to streets. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, The Nation, The Guardian, The Washington Post, The New Republic, The Atlantic, and many others. Sarah will discuss her latest book, Work Won't Love You Back: How Devotion to Our Jobs Keeps Us Exploited, Exhausted, and Alone. Told through the lives and experiences of various workers, from the unpaid intern, the overworked teacher, to non-profit employee, the domestic worker, and even the professional athlete, her book reveals how we have all been tricked into a new tyranny of work. Alongside Sarah, as in the role of moderator and discussant for today, we have Jurgis Uzelis. Jurgis is a political economist currently working as a research fellow at the University College London and a visiting lecturer at King's College London. His scholarly interests lie in the area of global political economy, international and comparative HRM, comparative industrial relations, and sociology of work and employment. Before I hand over the session to Jurgis, a few general housekeeping rules. Please feel free to introduce yourselves and share your thoughts in the chat box. If you have any questions, type them down in the questions tab below. Also upvote them so that it is easy for Jurgis to choose from them. Over to you, Jurgis.
Great. Thank you very much for this invitation to this very interesting event. So it's really a pleasure to discuss Sarah's latest book, which I found really interesting and contains lots of insights, both for practitioner academics, but also for the general public. So to begin with a brief introduction, I think, like every good book, Sarah starts by addressing and debunking a well-known myth, let's say. And this is, in this case, is that the well-known saying that if you choose a job you love, you won't work a day in your life. This is something we heard from our parents, we heard from our friends, or most likely our employers. And I think this is one of the most well-known myths about work here for decades. And what's most interesting is that this is not just a belief within the public. It has also affected economic theory and economic practice. We all hear about inequality these days, especially after the 2008 crisis. And most of mainstream economic thinking says that it is all about productivity. You're not productive enough, and this is why we have inequality. And why you're not productive enough? Because probably you don't love enough your job, or you haven't yet found a job you love enough. Well, this is a quite narrow view that doesn't quite address this issue as it should be. So Sarah's book is an important step towards this direction. And what makes it even more important is, in my view, that it uses an approach that is not very common even within academia. Instead of looking at tangible things, how much we get paid, not that, it looks at how people feel about their jobs, about emotions. And she's doing that by interviewing people in a very, very wide variety of occupation, quite standard categories like teachers, care workers, F&B workers, interns. We are aware about exploitations exploitation in these sectors. But she also goes beyond that by examining some very, very interesting categories we know very little about. Academics, for example, charity employers, college athletes, art workers, or even game coders. These are very unique examples of occupations which can offer insights about work organization and how people feel about their work, which we haven't heard about before. So this analysis, I think, tries to address a number of questions, and it does in a very interesting way. I think the three most important questions that the book answers is how this new work ethics that I briefly mentioned before changes the way we see ourselves as workers, but more broadly as part of a society. The second part is how this affects solidarity, both in the workplace, but also in the society, and what that means about social cohesion more broadly. And finally, about the workplace itself, how these new work ethics shape the future of work. So, Sarah, the floor is yours. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you. I am so pleased to be here. It is early in the morning on my end, and so I am like shaking myself awake here. But I'm very pleased to be here virtually. I wish I could be there in person. Someday travel will be a thing again. I'm missing that particularly because as Yildiz was saying, I'm a journalist. I'm not an economist. I'm not a academic. I do what I do sort of out in the world, talking to people about their work. And I also read a lot of books and a lot of reports and a lot of all of these things, and hopefully bring these things together in some sort of a synthesis that is hopefully useful for people. That very flattering introduction made me feel like I did something right. So thank you. So I have been interested in work because I've had a lot of not very good jobs myself. And that, is the thing that I think leads a lot of us to start writing about work and studying the workplace. But also because it's just where many, many people spend most of our waking hours. And so it's just a huge part of most people's lives. And yet, as you're saying, we often talk about it in terms of lists of numbers and not about people's actual experience with it, motivations, all of these expectations that are placed on work. And so, like I imagine many of you, I was told when I was growing up by my parents that, work hard and go to college and get a job and it'll be a good job and you'll have a career and buy a house and have a family and all of these things that I have not in fact done. But I've written 2 books, so. And so, of course, I've been working as a labor journalist in the time that it has become increasingly clear that this whole narrative about how our lives were going to go was increasingly not true, if it had ever been true. It had always only been true for perhaps a small portion of the workforce globally, let alone just a small portion of the workforce in the country where I live most of the time, which is the United States, of course. And so, most of my reporting for this book was in North America and Europe. That said, a lot of this discourse has been exported because that is the thing about America being the global hegemon, is we outsource a lot of things. And one of them is bullshit discourses about work. So the labor of love is a form of sort of common sense of the neoliberal era. And what I mean by that is it serves as a motivating tool to get us to commit more fully to work at a time when working conditions are getting worse for many, 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 many people, when inequality is growing, again, globally and within countries, and when, importantly, production itself requires fewer workers. So fewer people are being employed in the sort of work of production, yet we work under a system that requires us to work in order to live. And increasingly that work has to be wage labor. And so I wish I knew more about what's going on in India right now, because it's fascinating, and hopefully I want to ask some of you questions. But so this narrative of loving your job, people sort of keep asking me, is this just a story of, middle-class white people who went to university? And it's actually not. Just in recent weeks and months, I've seen ads for Amazon warehouse work saying, get a job delivering smiles. And people have found ads for like maid services, house cleaners, to be a passionate person about cleaning. So what is this thing that has happened that expects us to love all of these different kinds of work, whether they be doing what I do or cleaning somebody else's house or packing boxes at an Amazon warehouse? And so in thinking about how to write this book, I was thinking about the fact that the popular discourse about the working class has not kept up with the reality of the working class. And again, I mean the global working class and also the working class within sort of national boundaries, because in both cases, we're missing the story of a large number of people who are women, who are not white, who are not in jobs that anybody would consider lovable. But the workers who might have assumed themselves middle class at one point are also starting to understand that their relationship to power means they too are still workers. So we're seeing both the leadership of, a global labor movement coming from people who have long been written out of the story, and also people who might have written themselves out of the story on the other end, coming to realize that they too are still workers. So this is, of course, influenced by the fact that working class life is not just shaped by the workplace, but by a host of factors outside the workplace, where, again, globally, we have housing crises and education and healthcare more costly, policing. We have, the rise of nationalist politicians, again, around the world, and care responsibilities are still being pushed onto women unpaid in the home, where immigration agents are either hounding workers out of the country or recruiting people to come in very specific and hyper exploitable conditions, where technology increases the amount of control that people have over, again, a variety of workers, whether that be your boss installing something on your work from home computer so they can tell how much time you're spending, or scheduling software that tracks productivity and sales by the quarter hour and cuts people out a little bit early, or the gadgets that Amazon warehouse workers wear in order to scan packages as they put them in boxes and ship them around the world. So all of this is, again, these are varying conditions that affect different workers differently. But one of the things that increasingly, again, people have in common is this idea that somehow we're supposed to find lovable work. And if we don't love the job we have, we should go find another one that we love more, and that will solve all of the problems. I will return to this point in a little bit, but and to mention something that my friend Joshua Clover in his book Riot, Strike, Riot calls the Affirmation Trap, which is something that came about after the beginnings of deindustrialization in places like the US, where rather than workers shutting down production in order to win their demands, they're suddenly in the position of sort of begging the factory owners to stay in the US and not pack it up and move it elsewhere. And he describes this as labor is locked into the position of affirming its own exploitation under the guise of survival. And I think this is an important part in this narrative of how we got to loving our jobs, because these jobs that you didn't expect to love, but suddenly had to beg for in order to exist, it's a lot easier to square that mental circle if we convince ourselves that our jobs are bringing us meaning and fulfillment rather than just a paycheck. So because of deindustrialization, the dominant jobs in the US now are in retail, healthcare, services, and technology. There's a lot of hype paid to the exciting knowledge economy, but more likely people are in some sort of service work. And these jobs, of course, come with their own affirmation trap, which is that you better smile and enjoy it or you're going to get fired. So this comes after a period of time where demands for workers' control were sort of reappearing across the industrialized world in places like Italy and also in Lordstown, Ohio. And the feminist revolution was also happening. The sort of flip side of the rebellion against the Fordist factory is the rebellion against the suburban home. And all of this, and this is something that I can, pull apart a little bit more if people have questions, but results in employers seeking out and needing these very sort of human traits that industrial capitalism tries to strip away. So when you're working in a factory or perhaps again, that Amazon warehouse, the workers, the Amazon workers that I've talked to lately are always telling me like, they expect you to be a robot. You're not allowed to go to the bathroom. You're timed for any sort of human need you might have. And then the flip side is all of these jobs where we are supposed to bring more of ourselves to work. You're supposed to love it. You're supposed to care. You're supposed to care about the people you serve, the people you teach, the people you take care of. And you're supposed to bring your creativity and your excitement and all of these things that, we take for granted as being human characteristics. Exercising these things is what's supposed to make work less miserable, but instead it just helps work get into every part of our lives and we never turn off. So briefly, the two halves of my book are focused on caring work and creative work. These are sort of the two halves of this labor of love narrative. An example from the first half of the book is that I talk about teachers who, particularly in the US, were hired. They focused on hiring women because women were cheaper, because women were supposed to be married and taking care of children in the home and not getting paid for it. And also the financial motivation for this is essentially covered up by talking about how women are naturally caring and good with children, and this is what we're naturally supposed to be doing. So women will naturally be excellent teachers, which, of course, elides all of the skill and hard work that goes into actually being a good teacher, which is terrifying to me. And it allows us to blame teachers for everything that goes wrong. And again, I can talk more about that if anybody has questions. And in the second half of the book, I profile video games programmers, which again is a global industry where, I was talking to games workers in the UK who had formed a union, but they're working in companies where they have workers in India and workers in Canada and workers in London, and they're all working on the same game because, of course, these companies want to be able to sell that same game in all of those countries. So you end up, again, with these regimes of work that start in one place and get exported as the same company moves all over the world. So the games companies, well, working in games is fun and exciting, right? Because video games are fun. So working on them must be fun, except actually often it's not. And often you're working really excessive hours of overtime. And again, these global work chains also mean that people are getting paid and treated very differently in different parts of the world because, well, yeah. So you all gave me a few questions to address in this sort of opening talk, and I've sort of touched on all of them already, but just to sort of answer them a little bit more directly. The first one was, why do we need to rethink and reassess our relation to work and employment in the 21st century? And the thing that I think that's really important, at least the part that I'm focusing on in this book, is that so many people have bought this myth that we are working to find fulfillment rather than to pay the rent. Even as, of course, millions and billions of people across the world are working in god-awful conditions, this has mystified the fact that we're all working, whether we like it or not, literally, in conditions of exploitation and alienation. To get back to, good old Karl Marx, we are still working to make profits for somebody else who is capturing the value from the work that we're doing and not paying us as much as the value we are creating. And so that's true whether or not you like your job. And so people have asked me a lot while talking about this book, well, what kind of advice do you have for people? Should we just all hate our jobs? Should we go get jobs we don't like? And I'm like, you should do whatever works for you, but you should never forget that you're still doing work for somebody else who is profiting off of it. You know, I wrote this book. I worked a ridiculous amount. I don't even want to tell you how many hours that I spent and how many, 80, 90, 100-hour work weeks that I spent finishing the damn thing. But it goes out by a publisher who controls where it will be distributed and how many copies will be printed and what they will be priced and where they will be available and whether and how you can buy them, which you should be able to buy in, at least in India, through Hearst, which is my UK and Commonwealth publisher. But they get to decide that, not me. It is still, even though it is out there with my name on the cover, is still actually alienated from my control in that way. So that's a thing. The second question, which I love, is how has capitalism combined with patriarchal neoliberalism successfully gaslighted us into undervaluing our bodies, minds, spirits, and solidarity in each other? And so, yeah, what I would say about this is the patriarchal part is really important because care work is gendered and naturalized as something that certain people are good at. It's also racialized that certain people are good at it, which is why, in countries like the US and the UK, we often see a lot of people hiring care workers who are immigrants from other countries. And we, again, tell this story that like women from the global South are somehow more naturally caring than white women. None of it makes sense, obviously, because it's not true. But if this work is something that people are naturally good at, and again, if this is work we do because we enjoy it, then that is in itself supposed to be a form of payment. Of course, I can't pay my landlord with my enjoyment of my job. I can't call my landlord and be like, hey, I gave this really great talk today and I had this great conversation and it was really cool and I feel really hype. Can I pay you with that? That doesn't work, right? I still need money, because that's what people take in return for whatever. So work is something that, once again, we're not naturally predisposed to do in the way that we might think we are. And then there's just this narrative, once again, that, if we don't love our jobs, there is something wrong with us. Then the solution there is to either work harder on yourself, right? You try harder to love your job, or it's to go get another job. It's not to talk to your coworkers about, hey, actually, none of us love this job. That's actually because our boss is abusive and doesn't pay us enough, and we work a lot of unpaid overtime, and, my knuckles hurt from typing all day, and whatever it might be. So that, in itself is undermining solidarity in a way that, combines with the competition. If you are somebody like me who works in publishing, then I am, inspired to compete against other people who are writing similar books. All of these things, undermine solidarity in a way. So how do we organize for recognition, rights, and living wages in the context of rising patriarchy, white supremacy, and biases across various axes? And yeah, this is the question, right? This is what I'm constantly trying to find the answers to, which is why in this book, each of the workers that I profile, and I profile sort of 10 different people who do 10 different kinds of work, I talk about the work that they've done to organize those jobs in various ways. Some of them are members of trade unions. Others are doing different kinds of organizing projects. I talk to artists and people who are organizing. So, my microphone being terrible again. So the challenge of organizing through global supply chains, fissured workplaces, piecework, misclassification, complicated and repressive migration regimes, rising racism and nationalism. What are all of these things for, right? Ultimately, they're all designed to keep working people isolated and separated from each other, whether that's a video game company using workers in India and workers in Canada and workers in the UK on the same game. it's harder to organize if you have people and I mean, literally, time zones trying to figure out how to do this talk. There were only a couple of hours when we're all awake and functional at the same time. Fissured workplaces, temp agencies, things like that, where you have multiple people in the same buildings, but employed by different bosses. Piecework, where you have people taking the work literally home. Misclassification, where people are employees, but aren't, this is the Uber model, right? Immigration laws, and of course, nationalist politicians who scapegoat immigrants for keeping wages low. And, immigrants don't get to set the wages. In fact, they are usually the ones being exploited by the wages. And the person who's responsible for wages being low is the person who sets the wage. So, but, there are many, many, many dangerous things about rising nationalism. But one of them is that, again, it teaches people to mistrust the people that they have the most in common with, actually, and side with the boss who has very little in common with you materially, but they speak the same language. They're from the same place. They practice the same religion. Their skin is the same color. And that is yet another way to exploit people. So solutions for this involve everything from, organizing up and down supply chains, where we have solidarity between garment workers in the global South and the retail workers in the global North who are selling those things. Conversations among the workforce at these global companies that, again, are, employing people across the world. We have to include fighting nationalist governments, nationalist regimes, nationalist political parties, and arguments and crackdowns on immigrants. COVID has made this even more difficult because a lot of people who normally would be protesting restrictions on movements are now sort of like, oh, but we need lockdowns, we need zero COVID, we need to control borders. This is going to be, and I'm about to hit my time limit, so I will stop with this one and just say this is something we should absolutely talk more about, because we actually have to have a better answer to border crackdowns in the time of COVID than we've had. So yeah, and I think that is my 20 minutes, and I'm sure people have other things we want to talk about.
Great, thank you very much, Sarah, for this wonderful overview of your book. I think the story of the book, this shift towards service work, and the promise that this will solve many of the problems and eventually creating more problems. It's a very, very interesting story, and how it affects people both in the global North and the global South at the same time. There are many interesting insights, both for policy, academia, but also for the general public to understand how our world works and how this situation turns one against each other, how undermines solidarity globally and within countries. Now, let me ask you a question that's slightly more specific, and it's related to the rise of the gig economy. It's a major development of the last few years and has been accelerated greatly with COVID during the last year or so. So, in my view, the whole premise of the gig economy is that you will be your own boss. It represents a non-standard employment relationship. There's no clear boundaries between employee and employer. Who is your boss? And who is the employee in this process? Who is exploiting who in this case? So based on the work you did for your book and your experience, of course, as a labor journalist, what do you think about that? How this process that has been accelerated greatly with COVID affects how we see ourselves in the workplace and more broadly in the economy?
Yeah, the gig economy, right? The thing about the gig economy is it's sold to us as this exciting technological innovation that like, ooh, Uber's so innovative. This is just a very old model of work, right? It's piecework. It's been around for literally hundreds of years. And the only thing that Uber did was figure out how to do it on an app. or TaskRabbit or Mechanical Turk or any of these other ways, again, that these massive multinational corporations figure out how to get a lot of people to do very sort of individualized, fissured tasks and call it a job, or not really call it a job, right? So how we think about this, the thing that I think about a lot with the rise of this in this particular period of time is that it's sold to us as you get to be your own boss. You get to control the conditions of your labor, right? It is, in a way, absorbing this understanding that people have of alienated work, right? Having a boss sucks. It does. It's not good. I'm a freelancer. I like not having a boss. Of course, that actually doesn't mean that I don't have a boss. It means I answer to a whole web of different people that are current, past, and future employers who hire me one piece at a time, right? So that, you know, the narrative is a lie, but I understand why it's appealing. And I think this is one of the things that we have to actually think about a lot more when we talk about it, is why is this narrative appealing to people? Why do people believe it, to the point where in California, after the state legislature had passed a law making it much harder for companies like Uber to misclassify their employees as not employees, as freelancers, as their own boss, people voted for the opposite. And they did it because, you know, Uber and Lyft spent millions of dollars on an ad campaign, but that still doesn't work unless that ad campaign is hitting something that feels real to people. So we have to understand what feels real and appealing about what these companies are selling, because what they're actually giving people is just really, you know, extra exploitative work with no labor protections in many places.
Thank you for that, Sarah. That was indeed very interesting. So, in a question linked to what you mentioned about Uber and Amazon lately, we see that in this dire environment, eventually some forms of employee organization emerges in this. Uber drivers were recently recognized as actual workers. Of course, that's only a small start. Across to being recognized as an actual worker. We see Amazon warehouse employees as well trying to organize, and I'm not sure if anyone in the audience saw that Amazon is posting banners everywhere in the workplace to not join the union. So at least some forms of work organization are emerging indeed within these new forms of employment and these new workplaces. So going back to the old question of famous book of Freeman Meadows, what do unions do? In this case, in these new workplaces, the new forms of employment, what these new unions should be doing, in your opinion? How strategies can be different from traditional unions, so to speak?
Yeah, I mean, we've seen the rise, and again, I'm sort of mostly talking about the US and the UK because that's where I know the most. But we've seen the rise of sort of new forms of unions and worker organizations that take into account the change in the workplace, right? That most people are not in a massive factory where it was, you know, as somebody was explaining to me recently, right, that the boss wants you all to be working in collaboration. That's what the factory is set up for. And so if you can take that and you organize the people in their own self-interest, you have a lot of power, but also it's easier because those workers are working together in that way. This is why now, in the sort of absence of those factories, some of the most organized and most militant workers in the US are now caring workers, but they are teachers and nurses who are, again, in a workplace where there are a lot of them who are all working together even if they are sort of, isolated caring for individual patients or in individual classrooms, they're still in a massive workplace where they are all broadly working for the same purpose. Whereas organizing Uber drivers is a lot harder because the app certainly isn't going to give you their information, right? So, I have friends who work for the unions that organize Uber drivers in the UK who handed me a stack of flyers and are just like, give these out when you take an Uber. It's one way to do it. In other cases, my friend Callum Kant, who wrote a book about being a Deliveroo he was a bike courier, talks about the parts of the city where the Deliveroo drivers would sort of hang out and wait for calls to come in as natural places for organizing. A lot of the organizing takes place within the community. And so you see the rise of things called worker centers in the US, where a lot of them will be rooted in a particular immigrant community. So in Minneapolis, among Somali refugee and immigrant community, because there's a big Somali immigrant and East African immigrant community in Minneapolis, people are probably familiar with Representative Ilhan Omar, and this is the community that she comes from. There is a worker center called the Awood Center, which works specifically with East African workers, a lot of whom are now in Amazon warehouses because Amazon has specifically tried to hire these, recent immigrant workers because they're easier to exploit. So this worker center is based in that community. They speak the language, they're sort of familiar with the cultural practices, everything from practicing Islam to the solidarity songs of worker organization back in Somalia. So in that space, they've been actually the first people to get Amazon to the bargaining table in the US, although Amazon denies that it's bargaining. They call it cultural outreach. But these workers were able to get concessions around work, specifically around having time to pray, having places to prepare to pray, and having accommodations during Ramadan when they're fasting. So there's organizing that sort of understands that within the community you can have a lot of power, particularly again if big companies like Amazon think that these workers are going to be extra exploitable. That's a way you can get in. So there have to be new practices of organizing that recognize that we're not all Ford factory workers anymore.
I think that's a very interesting example of how unions should be reacting to this new environment. For instance, this described out immigrant workers and how religion and culture should be taken into account into the demands of such unions, except for whatever tangible wage rates and all. So I think this is really, really important. Another thing that I was thinking about when reading your book and thinking about today's discussion was as you think about how COVID changed our perception on what is meaningful work and important work in a society, given this neoliberal, let's say, view. It's part of, again, this mainstream wisdom that only high-skilled work is valuable, and these people deserve to getting paid more than anyone else in the society. This type of inequality is natural and normal, and it's nothing to worry about. And we are now in the midst of a pandemic, and we suddenly realize that what is really important, who are the really important workers in the society. So do you think this huge shock will change how the wider public understands people and induce sort of more solidarity between working class people?
I hope so. It is definitely interesting to see the sort of recognition of the work that we would call like social reproduction work, right, is actually the work that people need day to day in order to survive. when we went all onto lockdown in the US, except for so-called essential workers, or I think in the UK, they called them key workers. And so who were those workers, right? They were delivery drivers, they were hospital workers, obviously healthcare workers, but they were also the person who works at the grocery store. They were the person at the pharmacy who gives you your medicine. And the other part of it is like the workers that people haven't had access to. So people in the US, this has been driving me bonkers, have been sort of flipping out about demanding that schools be reopened. In many cases, the schools are already reopened. In other cases, they're moving towards it. And there's a lot of blaming of teachers for not wanting to die, which is just, I think it's totally reasonable that teachers don't want to die. Also, as a person who is not a teacher, does not have children, but also doesn't want to be on lockdown anymore because I live alone, I would really like us to not try to breed new variants of this virus so that we go through this for the next 20 years. I would really like us to actually not do that. That would be great. But we're noticing that because parents are suddenly stuck at home with their children all day. And teachers are working, right? Teachers are teaching virtually all day long. I've been interviewing teachers about teaching virtually, and was talking to somebody who teaches elementary school over Zoom, which I can't imagine teaching 6-year-olds on Zoom all day. But he was like, it's great. I have wigs and costumes and things, and I do costume changes and, have to do all these things to make sure the kids stay interested, because otherwise, you can't just lecture at Zoom for, first graders. It's not going to work. So, the demand for sort of these workers to get back to work, their health be damned, has also shown us the sort of negative side of understanding essential work, right? Although poll after poll shows that parents actually mostly side with the teachers. It's just the people who get to write op-eds for major newspapers who are going to blame the teachers. So, yeah, that is all to say, I don't think there's anything we can be guaranteed that will change out of this. It's going to be a matter of organization, and that's going to be sort of fights over the narrative, and it's going to require political understanding and political work to say okay, remember when we all talked about essential work? Yeah, those workers need a raise. And so in the UK right now, right, where the government announced a 1% raise for NHS nurses, and the nurses are like, oh, hell no. And so there's now organizing and pushback going on around that. And there were polls that show that the public would even support a nurses' strike, which is, tough. People don't really love when essential workers go on strike, but people did realize, and partly because the nurses are willing to speak up and be like, this is garbage, what are you talking about? A 1% raise is essentially a pay cut, right? Because inflation, because housing prices in a lot of the UK are ridiculous. So there is a level of solidarity that, is being offered to those workers, but then it's still going to depend on what they do about it. Because, Boris Johnson has shown that he'll back down on things if there's public pressure, because he really only cares about one thing, and that's being Boris Johnson. But it will require militancy on the part of those workers to actually make sure that it happens.
Great, thank you very much. So I do have some other questions, but I think we have several questions in the chat, in the Q&A. So I would like to move on to those. So we have a first question. I think this is an anonymous question, unfortunately. So for instance, how do the self-help book stuff like Rich Dad, Poor Dad, 4-Hour Work Week, etc., that tell you what we have to switch away from selling labor to selling capital, and yet still exploit others, fit into all this discussion?
Oh my goodness. I mean, yeah, I find this really interesting, right? A very good friend of mine writes about finance, and Bitcoin is his, number one, whatever. He's every time I talk to him, he's like, yes, Bitcoin. And so the thing with GameStop a few weeks ago, months ago, what is time anymore? where people bought a bunch of stock in this dying video games retail store. Why is it all about video games? In order to get revenge on rich people, basically. And so this idea that like you can buy stocks in order to sort of get revenge on the stock market, it doesn't work, right? Like that's what we saw with GameStop, is it didn't work. And when it started to sort of blow up some big hedge funds, investments, they essentially just like pulled the plug on it. And they got the app that people were using to buy the stocks to pull the plug on it, because you can't actually like out capital. It just doesn't work that way, right? So my friend Alexis Goldstein, who used to work in finance, was testifying in front of Congress on this subject this week, and saying, everybody sort of wrote this as like a David versus Goliath story, but really it was just Goliath versus Goliath, because somebody was underwriting these trades that were happening at this app, and that was just another hedge fund. It was just like big capital versus big capital. So this idea that we can somehow, become capital is, it's similar to the narrative about being your own boss. You can somehow like sort of tap out of the cycle of being an exploited worker. Unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. In order to be capital, you have to have a lot of money. Said friend who writes about finance made me watch The Big Short finally last week. So I made him watch Sorry to Bother You, which everybody should watch, as a wonderful movie about exploited labor. And yeah, so I watched The Big Short, and it's a reminder, right, that like there are no good guys in that story, because all of the guys in The Big Short who figured out that we were riding on a massive property asset price bubble, they were all jerks who were trying to make money off of it too. You have to have extraordinary amounts of money to compete in that playing field. So, but it's great if you can convince everybody that buying stock on whatever the app was called, I forget what it was called, Robinhood, actually, that's what it was called, which is hilarious, right? If you become a day trader on Robinhood, well, somebody's just making money off of you doing that. So, these things are all, again, sort of designed to capitalize, pun totally intended, on people's desire to not have a boss and not have a job, because being a worker sucks. Being capital would be much better, except that you can't unless you have a ridiculous amount of money.
Great. Yeah, that's interesting. The movie is certainly great. For those of you who haven't watched it, it's a great story about actual people, how things actually happen with the crisis. For those of you studying economics, do not forget that one of the major people that advocated against financial speculation, Keynes, John Maynard Keynes, lost a fortune in the stock market.
Yeah, he was big on speculating. A friend of mine actually just wrote a biography of Keynes this year.
Maybe it's part of the process of understanding how things work.
Yeah.
Perhaps. So back to our Q&A. I have another question about the issue of the alienation of work, and a member of our audience asks, assuming that we try to restructure some of the inequities, there will always be work which is not fulfilling, but needs to be done instead. So how do we deal with that? This perhaps non-meaningful work that has to be done.
Yeah, and that's the real question, right? Is like my argument in this book is that loving your job and getting a lovable job is not going to save us from these problems. So, I mean, this is kind of the question, right? It's like, okay, imagine we're thinking about the essential work, right? And some of that essential work might be fun. Being a first grade teacher, it sounds incredibly stressful to me because children terrify me, but I am living proof that women are not naturally good at caring for children. But, some of this work that needs to be done might be enjoyable, fulfilling. Some of it is just scrubbing toilets. Scrubbing toilets, I have done that for a living. It is not fun. There is no way to make it fun. There are, however, ways to improve working conditions and to distribute work differently. So, the argument that I would make coming out of this book is we have to spend a lot less time focusing on whether individual people will like the individual work they do, and much more time thinking about how we improve work for everyone, which means that it has to be improved for the people who are scrubbing toilets. Hospital cleaners, once again, are the kind of worker that we really should have learned in the last year, are absolutely indispensable, because if the hospital is not kept clean, we all get COVID, right? But this is work that has been devalued. And part of the reason that it's been devalued is we associate with dirt the people who clean dirt, right? And so we have to actually just massively rethink how we value this. And part of that has to be improving in any way we can the conditions in the unpleasant work. So whether you're picking up garbage or scrubbing toilets or cleaning a hospital's operating room, this work has to be made less miserable, much more valuable, and safer, because it's very often not safe at all. One of the statistics we like to point out in the US every time there's sort of complaints by police officers that people are not valuing them enough is that actually it is much, much, much more dangerous to be a garbage collector than a police officer. There are many more deaths in the course of work, working for the sanitation department than working for the police department. So yeah, there are a lot of ways we could improve this work while also accepting that you're probably not ever going to like it. So how do we distribute it differently, and how do we treat it better?
Great. Yeah, that's indeed a very important question, I think. So yeah, of course, it's about the social norms in society, how we see different type of jobs, and how society makes us think about certain activities. Jobs that have to do with dirt are not very desirable by anyone. Of course, there's jobs that have to be done. Continuing about the different types of work and workers that you examine in your book, we have a question by San, who asks about the nature of NGO work and how, in the name of social justice, it co-opts the narratives of revolutionaries and exploits workers, especially those who are earnest about tackling systemic oppression. And so the question is really about how does capital work with NGOs and NPOs?
Yeah, there is a whole chapter in this book about nonprofits, NGOs, charities, whatever we call them, wherever we are. They are, wherever they are, sort of band-aids on the face of capitalism, right? And are dependent for their very existence on either state support, private support, usually from, big philanthropies, and both. And that means that there are going to be limits most of the time on how revolutionary you can be in an organization that is getting funding from any number of rich people. This is why everybody likes to make George Soros the boogeyman. I mean, other than anti-Semitism is why they like to make George Soros the boogeyman. But the reality of it, though, is that this is still work that happens under capitalism. And even though, in the US anyway, the designation literally has not for profit in the title, it's not so easy to get your structures of work out from under capitalism, even if we sort of accept the limited ability of NGOs to actually advocate for a real change in an economic system. Even accepting that, you still see, so for instance, the worker that I profile for this chapter in the book works at Planned Parenthood, which, provides healthcare and abortion services and all of these other very necessary things, many times for low-income people who don't have access to health insurance, because America, who needs health insurance? And the workers at the Planned Parenthood were making something like $12, $13 an hour, which is not very much money, and were working extremely long hours, were facing anti-abortion protesters outside of their workplace every day, were, doing incredibly emotionally difficult work of, talking to people about their healthcare, talking to people about pregnancies that they want, then talking to people about pregnancies they don't want, diagnosing people with cancer, all of this stuff, which is incredibly difficult. So the workers decided that they wanted a union. And what happened to them at this ostensibly progressive nonprofit service organization is the same thing that happened to workers at Amazon, which is that the boss called them in for captive audience meetings to tell them about how they didn't need a union and they could talk to their bosses themselves. And they got all of this pressure from the top, and the boss hired an anti-union law firm. And yeah, it was a textbook union busting campaign at a nonprofit, because the boss still doesn't want to give up any power, even in, again, ostensibly a progressive organization, progressive feminist organization. So this is the real challenge. And you know, if you try to organize in workplaces like this, you will be told that you are hurting the clients, patients, members, however your organization refers to them. You will be hurting the people that you serve. A Planned Parenthood regional affiliate, I forget what the title was, executive in any case, told the New York Times, well, if we give our workers healthcare, then we're going to have to close clinics. You will get the zero-sum game, frankly, bullshit. And you can't actually take good care of people when your working conditions are crap. This is true if you work in a hospital. This is true if you work in Planned Parenthood. This is true if you work in a small community organization that is trying to advocate for immigrant workers. If you are stressed and exhausted and broke and worried about how you're going to pay your own bills, you are not going to be in any position to help anybody else. And so, like, on a very basic level, you know, work in a nonprofit is still work. On a much bigger level, of course, right, there is the challenge of like you saying things like the entire economic system is based on exploitation and we should probably stop that and take away all Jeff Bezos's money. Philanthropists don't like that too much, but we kind of have to do it anyway.
That's a bit true. There are many similarities with the higher education sector.
Mm-hmm.
US and the UK. It's again a not-for-profit sector in the UK at least, and in many cases in the US as well. And yet again, attracting external research funding has become central. Universities, and typically big grants and big money comes from philanthropists, which questions how much critical you can be when you ask to fund your research through this type of organizations. So I think it's quite similar. And what that means about freedom of speech and academic freedom, both for NGOs and universities. Unfortunately, we have an example right now happening in the UK with Leicester Business School of redundancy because of being too critical. And it's really fascinating that this is a not-for-profit organization. This is not a capitalist negotiating with an employer. It's just a public institution. Just shows, I think, how pervasive is this logic you try to outline in your book, and how that affects even not-for-profit sectors of the economy. So back to our Q&A, we have a question about how your book was received differently by men and women, and about the well-intentioned strategization by your publisher in this context. If you
So I wanted to say one more thing on the university's question, because I was thinking about this. I was looking at somebody on Twitter, is actually in the UK, was talking about the assault on academia as actually being similar to the sort of decomposition of the industrial working class in the 80s, because actually auto workers, miners were actually viewed as the center of opposition to neoliberalism, right? Not just sort of they were holding up profits, but they were actually where the rebellion was going to be. And that was sort of the intellectual center of the rebellion, which I thought was a really interesting point, because we often don't think of factory workers, miners as the intellectual center of a movement, but they were. And now this attempt to sort of decompose the university is happening because that is the center of opposition to neoliberalism. So critical academics like those at Leicester, and a friend of mine works there, are the ones who are, now understood as the sort of breeders of a narrative that is opposed to this thing. And so they have to be decomposed as a class and as a workforce. So I thought that was a really interesting point that is not unrelated to the question about gender. It's really funny. I actually, I've definitely talked to sort of feminist podcasts and magazines and been written up in, fashion magazines. Marie Claire UK did a feature on this book, which is great. I'm pleased. And there was one reviewer who noted sort of that most of the characters in this book were women, and was sort of like, what would a book like this about men look like? And I was like, why do you not see yourself in women workers, my friend? That is my question to you. Why is it hard to understand that like your conditions in retail work will also be shaped by gendered expectations, even if you are not a woman? So yeah, I mean, I don't know, like the weirdest thing about doing everything on Zoom is I'm much less like, I don't know the gender of the person who asked that question because they just show up as anonymous attendee in this thing, right? So it's much harder for me to know, like, because I'm not getting in-person reactions in the same way, which I think is it's frankly really depressing. I miss talking to actual people. I miss seeing all of your faces. So yeah, it's a thing I would probably have like more understanding of if I was actually out in the world and being able to sort of look at like the gender breakdown of audiences that are coming to talks, and sharing the works. I haven't been asked for interviews by Men's Magazine. That's not true. I did an interview for Fatherly, which is a site targeting dads. So that is one. Yeah, so I don't really have as good an answer to this question as I wish I did, because I too much Zoom.
Great, that was interesting though. So to move on to the next question, we have a question by Manav. If I forgive me, I pronounce wrongly your name. How have words like professionalism, passion, dedication, and so on used as a tool to nurture and cultivate neo slavery?
Yeah, I mean, you got to be passionate about cleaning floors, right? But also everything else. And dedication, as far as I can tell, is just code for really long hours. And professionalism is a really interesting one. And this is one that I spend a little bit of time with in the chapter on teachers, because there's been this tension, particularly among teachers in the US and between the sort of two big teachers unions in the US, who have sort of gone back and forth, both of them, around narratives of professionalism. And it's really interesting to see the way that like often the most effective organizing among teachers has been a rejection of narratives of professionalism, because they were sort of ineffective and easily turned against them. And also they were really gendered. So women started the first teachers union in the US in Chicago and led it and were really successful years before they had anything like legal recognition or collective bargaining rights, very successful in winning political campaigns around the public schools by organizing in the community with their students and parents. And then when the union gets formalized, the women who had led it get shoved to the side and men get put in charge, because men are serious professionals and women are just, temporarily employed housewives. So that, like, professionalism in particular, is often code for making sure that white men are in charge, at least in America and in, I think, the UK as well. And it's this is true of computer programming as well, by the way. So when things like the ENIAC, which is like the first big computer created during World War II in the States, the people who programmed it at first were women. And then at some point, men got the hint that this was actually like potentially prestigious and exciting work, and literally sort of wrote this narrative around it that said that to be good at computer programming, you actually should be sort of antisocial and not very good with people, but you would be very good with machines somehow, because not being good with people and being good with machines are apparently mutually exclusive. And they actually instituted like personality tests to change this narrative around what somebody who was good at this would look like. But it didn't professionalize, and Ben Tarnoff has written about this really interestingly. It didn't professionalize the same way that like becoming a lawyer or a doctor did. So you don't have the same sort of, you don't have to get like approved by a professional body to become a programmer the same way you do to be a doctor or a lawyer. But nevertheless, there are sort of gatekeeping rules around it. And these kinds of professional organizations have often just served to sort of institute hierarchies of work. So yeah, I find that one a really specifically a very interesting one. But of course, also a lot of the times when your boss tells you to be professional or that you're a professional worker, you don't need a union. It's just to keep you from, you know, causing trouble.
Now I'd like to move on to a question that's linked to that, exactly again, about how we speak and how do we value work differently. I have a question by Geeta, who asks if you can tell us a little bit about all the motivational speakers in the leadership training industry that has emerged alongside the service industry to get people to work more efficiently and love or pretend to love their jobs.
Yeah, the TED Talk industry, right? Yeah, and it's so interesting. Like I didn't really study this much for this book. There are other researchers who spent a lot more time with sort of the management literature and management training industries. But the thing that I've been really fascinated with actually is the like Instagram platitudes industry, which is not disconnected at all from sort of motivational speakers, especially during COVID when now everybody's just moved online. And so, you know, everybody is sort of sharing platitudes about like, love yourself and love your whatever and love your job. And everything is about like, you know, if you have, oh God, what was the one that like sent me over the edge the other day? It was something like, you know, if you're not fulfilled, it's you know, ask yourself if you really need the external recognition or you just need to recognize yourself. And I was like, I need external recognition, actually. I need to get paid. You know, and so I'm fascinated by how this sort of narrative of like love yourself and love whatever and love what you do and do, you know, are all connected, really. And you know, the way that self-care has gone from something that, you know, a revolutionary Black feminist talked about as part of political organizing to, you know, a yoga retreat that somebody will sell you, a very expensive yoga retreat, to be able to come back and be more productive on Monday. And yeah, it's so transparently a scam once you start to connect the dots, right? And yeah, like you can become a life coach and coach people to work harder and get better at their jobs. And really, you know, what you just need is actually organizing, not TED Talks. Motivational speakers.
That's a new industry emerging. Really interesting what exactly it contributes and how we should feel about it. But so we are almost out of time. I think we have time for just a last question before I hand over to Thinking Economics India Organizing Committee. So we have a question about this shift from the workplace to homes and whether this trend is to stay, and what also what a smaller work week will look like in order to balance work-life fulfillment and also life outside work.
Yeah, work from home has the same initials as wages for housework, which kept tripping me up during the first few months of lockdown. People would like abbreviate work from home, WFH. And I was like, wages for housework? Oh, no, but they are connected. Because of course, like, right, what happens when you're working at home all day? Is that my apartment is a total mess because I'm, especially the last few months since my book came out, and I'm just doing a lot of this on like a Sunday. So instead of cleaning my house on Sunday, I'm talking to all of you, which is more fun also. But it also means that like the part of my apartment you can't see on this Zoom call is just a wreck and I really need to clean. And that kind of thing is so much more obvious now. The way that, working from home is stressing everybody out. It also means that, your home is not your home. I mean, I'm literally, at a desk next to my bed here. That probably screws with my sleep in ways I don't even realize that, and I've been working from home for most of the last 10 years. As a freelancer, and even, the last 2 staff jobs I had were still work from home. So this was obviously a trend that was ongoing. WeWork existed to take advantage of the fact that there were lots of people already who didn't have workplaces. So I think COVID will absolutely like teach a lot of companies that they don't have to pay expensive rent in like the center of New York or London or Mumbai or any other place where it might cost you $1 bazillion to have a physical headquarters. And also that, if you push all the costs back onto the worker. I was just doing my taxes this week and looking at all of the things that I deduct because I spend all of this money myself because I don't have a workplace. So all of my printing costs, all of my shipping costs, all of my internet, all of my whatever, the ring light to make me look, shiny and like I've slept last night when I'm on a Zoom call. All of these things are my costs. And I, have to deduct those off my taxes, which I can do to some degree, but not enough. And yeah, I mean, this is all to circle back to the question of a shorter working week, which I think we all desperately need. And one of the things that this circles back to the questions of distributing the essential work better, discovering what is not essential work, probably, and figuring out, like, as a society, what is the work that needs to be done? How do we distribute that fairly, treat it better, value it properly, and give everybody some time off and do all of this in time to not cook the planet? So small challenges, no worries. It's all going to be real easy. I don't think that, any of this is going to sort of be granted to us out of the niceness or kindnesses of bosses or politicians, frankly, hearts. But it is in the conversation now, right? And that is helpful. The US government just passed a massive, COVID relief package that includes for the first time payments to parents. So a form of child allowance or child benefit, which we've never had in this country. For everyone, which is huge. And it's temporary in this relief bill, but hopefully having had it, we can fight for it. Spain is talking about trialing a 4-day work week, right? So there are definitely conversations that like are being pushed forward right now. To steal the lines from our, my worst enemy, Milton Friedman, we need to not let a good crisis go to waste and actually be the people who are around with ideas this time. Because I mean, neoliberalism's got the same ones. They've still got Milton Friedman's ideas. They don't have anything new. They haven't replaced Milton with anybody who's smarter. So we actually have to be the people who are around with the better ideas this time as we're coming out of crisis, and coming out of one crisis into the bigger one, which is of course climate change. So it's always depressing when I end with climate change. I was like, oh yeah, so all of these things are happening, and also half the world's going to be uninhabitable in about 20 years. So great, we need to hurry up and start working less.
Great, thank you very much, Sarah, for that. Yeah, it's a bit sad when you listen to, but at least we have many students in the audience today with us, and this is a new opportunity for people to rethink those things and provide new solutions to all those problems we face. So I think we're officially out of time at the moment. So Sarah, thank you very much for this wonderful discussion and for the insights from your book. I really enjoyed the discussion. Also, I'd like to thank the audience for the very interesting questions. Unfortunately, we didn't have enough time to answer all of them, but hopefully we'll cover most topics asked in these questions. And again, thank you very much to the Rethinking Economics India network for inviting me to moderate discussion. So over back to you.
Thank you, Sarah and Jurgis, for taking time out for this session. It was a pleasure to have you with us. We hope all of you enjoyed this session. We have 2 more sessions on patriarchy in the last 2 weekends of April, touching upon gender, debt, austerity, and rethinking the care economy. The registration links would be up on our social media handles. In case any of you are interested, please feel free to reach out to us at india@rethinkeconomics.org or use any of the links mentioned in the chat box below. Have a great weekend, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.